It wasn't too long ago that I made a video discussing how to make a proper broken character, focusing on tragedy and how that can be used as a means for proper narrative tool to express the themes of two particular shows. In that video I focused on two characters, Kinger from the Amazing Digital Circus and Comrade Valen from Kamen Gavv, both of whom I still stand by as good examples for the topic at hand. The former being a prime example of how someone, despite the tragic situation they're put in, can act as a literal beacon of hope for other characters, with the latter however being pushed to the brink by the monsters of the series, became a vessel of revenge that made the character push himself into doing extreme things, such as getting a backroom surgery with no anesthesia to insert an alien organ into his body, and immediately after that getting into a fight where he's basically on the brink of death. I love the use of broken characters in these shows, and how they could be used in different ways so they could be seen to the audience. Now, straight up, we're going to try to be positive in this video, but unlike the last one, we'll also be covering some negative examples too. And as usual, this is just my thoughts on these characters and my perspective. Nothing I say is objective, and I'm obviously human, I think. My point is, prepare yourselves, we're about to go in the spoiler territory. Spoilers for the following properties. I'm MangaKamen, and I'm pretty sure we're gonna piss someone off. Let's begin. The Great Ace Attorney. I've loved Ace Attorney ever since I got my hands on the games, and its characters are what brings me back again and again, though the music was also a contributing factor too. But the games have almost a plethora of characters that are tragic, with varying degrees, in how that tragedy can be used to motivate them for good and evil actions. Hell, you could look at Phoenix Wright himself, who not only had his childhood friend turned to a prosecutor, he lost his mentor, his mentor's killer tried to get him locked up for said murder, his childhood friend tried to prosecute him for that, and his first girlfriend's sister almost killed him and framed him for murder. Again! How is this man functioning in the world after all that? Nori had so much grape juice and became a hobo for 7 years. But rather, I like to talk about how tragedy can lead you into a toxic spiral. And this is where the Great Ace Attorney comes into play, and more specifically, the character Barak Van Zykes. This is going to be a big one, folks, and it's one that's going to require going into some touchy subjects like murder, racism, and all that fun jazz. Hooray! Yeah, this video ain't getting monetized now, is it?
No, unacceptable.
Oh well. In any case, Barak is the prosecutor for the Great Ace Attorney. Set in 19th century Great Britain, there are tensions between the Japanese people and the British, as demonstrated by a lot of the questionable comments from the British citizens, including people on juries. Ah, yes, a devious Eastern sorcerer using magic on the jury. That must be why people are changing their minds about a guilty plea. And the police aren't above using stereotypes either. Now, I need to stress something. Depiction of racism isn't necessarily racist, especially considering how the themes of Ace Attorney, and most especially the Great Ace Attorney, are focused on the idea of things are not what they seem. And I want to make it clear, if you're uncomfortable with racism being depicted in a game, that's your prerogative, and you're not wrong to feel that way. I would argue though that sometimes we do need to be uncomfortable in these topics so we can learn and become better from seeing how it's depicted, and there are things in the games that are historically accurate to give some ideas on things, such as the window tax and the defendant of the second trial, Soseki Natsume, an actual Japanese author who was an exchange student to study the English literature and is depicted in the game as well. Not to mention his living relatives actually gave the crew of the game the go-ahead to use him, and the original Soseki actually did experience racism by the English. So what does that have to do with Barak? Well, he's not above the racist comments, often referring to the main character Ryunosuke as Nipponese.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
Honestly, this is bad, but in the context of the time and location, as well as how acceptable it was to have these thoughts, as people are saying this stuff in open court, it's not out of the realm of possibility for this stuff to be seen as alright to say in this setting. Is it bad to say this stuff? Obviously, but that's the point. Racism isn't cool. Sad I have to say that in a video. It establishes that this is a hostile environment to the main characters who are Japanese, and it ties back into the theme of disillusion, since Great Britain was seen as this shining beacon to the world and the characters, ahead of the curve in technology, culture, and social standing. Great Britain at the time was leading the world in so many aspects, and its people were teeming with arrogance. And you have to remember that most people in the country just didn't have the contact to the outside world or people of other countries. It's an explanation for why they believe these things, but that's not an excuse. And this stuff shows that even Great Britain isn't as great as the characters thought. My point is, when looking towards a character like Barak Van Zykes and his own personal tragedy and how it affected not only his views and mindset, it's important that we look at the lens of the time and setting and not in a modern day view. I'm saying all of this about Barak as a character and how the tragedy to his self-admitted irrational prejudices led him to the shell of a man that he became. I'm saying all of this to talk about Barak as a character and how the tragedy to his self-admitted irrational prejudices led him to the shell of a man he once was. When Barak was just beginning his prosecution career, he was attacked by some thugs, but was saved by a Japanese exchange student, Genshin Asogi, and the two became good friends, with Barak having a deep respect for the man. During this same time, there were a number of murders in the streets of London that were occurring by a figure called the Professor. He had killed multiple nobles, including the mentor and benefactor to Barak's brother, Clint. Eventually, the Professor's killings actually managed to claim Clint's life, and Barak was shaken by this loss, even more so when the culprit was thought to be Genshin Asogi. So that led to the inevitability of Barak wanting to get revenge for his brother and prosecuting Genshin in a secret trial to avoid war between Britain and Japan. The loss of his brother, the betrayal of someone he called a friend, and the general culture at the time pretty much twisted Barak into a cold-hearted man who had disdain to the Japanese people. Now, there's been a lot of debate on this character, but a lot of people tend to not actually view this all in a singular context of what was going on and ignore that there was more than just being betrayed, especially considering his brother was practically the only family that Barak had. Because the whole thing is irrational, and that's something Barak himself acknowledges in his hatred that isn't logical, and he's willing to swallow his hatred and pride when Ryunosuke, the guy who has locked horns with Van Zykes in court for a long time, is willing to help him. But that's not the only thing. As it turns out, his brother was actually the real professor, and the evidence he was given at the time was fabricated, with Barak convicting the wrong person for the murders. This is a lot of heavy stuff that Barak does need to accept, especially since he was being used as a puppet and scapegoat. If at any point the evidence was exposed to be false, the blame would fall onto him. But what really sealed the deal was that Genshin admitted responsibility for the crimes. It's a lot for a person to handle. Again though, this is an explanation, not an excuse. The harsh truth of the matter does get thrown into Barak's face, and he's made to acknowledge to Ryunosuke that he was wrong for the countless discourtesies that he did. And here's the thing, while Barak does redeem himself, but admitting that he was in the wrong, his hatred was illogical and he needs to change, that he still needs to atone for his actions and words. Because it's not enough to acknowledge your mistakes, you need to take action in order to fix them, and he does two things before the game ends. Publishing the full truth of the Professor case, exonerating the falsely accused while also further staining his own name in the process, and taking Kazuma Asogi, the son of Genshin Asogi, under his wing to become a prosecutor. There is a big flaw to the writing of Barak that I will acknowledge, and it's basically that. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of Barak redeeming himself and acknowledging the hurtful rhetoric that he used. That's the only thing I can say that is a meaningful criticism of the writing of his character in these games, since it does need to be called out. Still, Barak does make for a dynamic, tragic character, someone whose loss and thoughts of betrayal led him down the path of destruction, and only when the truth was revealed did he actually admit to himself that he was wrong. That's a good example of tragedy being used and a character warping themselves for the worse, but learning to be better. It's not perfect, mind you, and you can obviously disagree with how it was written. I certainly do. But to me, he's a great character to show how tragedy can affect a person for the negative. Too bad I can't really say that for the next character. You know, there was a very infamous video game out there, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Based off the 1886 novella with the same name, it's an infamous for a reason. Bad graphics even for its time, the bizarre choices in gameplay, and the game was highlighted in the second episode of The Angry Video Game Nerd. Nothing is explained to the player, some characters actually harm the PC, but others wouldn't, and it'd be super confusing. The game is so infamous that it was often suggested to be given to students studying game design to play so they can learn what not to do. This is your fact I cannot prove the day! And this leads into this particular example of writing for a broken character, and the tragic events that led them to become said broken characters. Because the example I want to give is something I feel that most writers should avoid the mistakes of. Oftentimes, when a character is given a backstory that is filled with tragedy, it's meant to show the audience what they were wronged, or because they were so hurt they had no choice but to break just to survive or become a worse person in the process. And that's perfectly fine. But just because a character does have a sympathetic backstory, that doesn't really matter in the regard if it doesn't really justify their actions or correlates to their current self. So, Rwby.
When you don't know where to turn to, and you sure all hope is...
Kamen, you know that the limit for clips is like like 7 seconds. I can't do a montage.
Honestly, it feels like I'm kicking a dead horse with how the series is in a bit of a limbo state, and whether or not it will continue with the current story or do a reboot, it's hard to say. Still, it's a series that I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with, mostly hate on YouTube publicly, and one of the factors of that is its villains. They're probably some of the weakest characters in terms of writing I've seen, with one of the worst being the most prominent of villains since the first season, Cinder. Cinder Fall is the secondary antagonist of the show, being a powerful magic user with the abilities of what the show has dubbed the Fall Maiden, which gives her mystical abilities.
This is so stupid!
She's also a horrible person who will backstab, who will throw away those who help her, and all to get a little more power. Whatever that means in this day and age. It should be obvious that I don't like her as a character or even as a villain, but that's not what I'm talking about here. So why am I bringing her up? Well, she's probably got one of the worst tragic backstories I've ever seen put to the screen for any character. How, you may ask? Well, let's take a look, shall we? Cinder's backstory is that she was an orphan with anger issues. Until she's adopted by a family to use her as cheap labor for our hotel, with a bit of a nod to the classic tale of Cinderella. Do you get it? Cause she's named Cinder and based off that fairy tale with Cinderella? Do you get it, folks? So as you can imagine, the goal of the backstory is to make you feel sorry for Cinder. You know, the character who before this had created a massive attack on people multiple times, killed a number of characters, and doesn't have any sort of charm to them. But I think the biggest problem with his backstory is that it defies logic, especially with this dumbass.
I'll be crying if I look like that too, bro. That's fucked up what they be doing to y'all. I ain't even gonna hold you.
So, this is Rhodes, a huntsman who actively sees Cinder being abused and does nothing. Oh, I suppose child slavery and torture is okay in the world of Rwby. Good to know, writers. But he gets into the fray after Cinder steals his sword and he decides to train her in combat in secret.
Okay.
But wouldn't it make more sense for him to, I don't know, sneak her out from the hotel, inform the proper authorities of the abuse going on, get the necklace that's shocking her off her neck, since huntsmen are supposed to preserve the peace? Now, one can argue huntsmen are supposed to fight the Grimm, the monsters of the show, and fair enough, but if that was the case, why even get involved with Cinder at all and train her? Why not just take your sword back and go about your business? If you're gonna get involved, especially with this sort of thing where you bond with the kid, why do it in such a half-ass way? Well, we don't know. The show never says. Instead, he decides to just continue letting her suffer while training her to become a dangerous person. What's the worst that could... Well, fuck! And it's done in a way we can't even see if this was done in self-defense or if Cinder was just murdering them out of cold blood. But before we can process that, Rhodes appears and...
Shut the fuck up, bitch.
Decides to attack the girl who he not only trained but knows for a fact was being abused by the three people here. There was a montage earlier in this very episode showcasing that Cinder and Rhodes were training and possibly bonding, so instead of trying to figure things out, the idiot decides the best idea is to attack the girl. Not that it matters, since despite everything, after he initially attacks her, Rhodes just lets his guard down and allows Cinder to kill him out of a moment of weakness. So, Cinder was just a psychopath the whole time who was being abused by other psychopaths and taught how to kill others by one of the biggest idiots in fiction. I know I've been really harsh on Rwby in the last few years, and this isn't the first time I've railed on this backstory, but if I felt that you're trying to make a tragic backstory and have some sympathy for the character in question, this one is the best example of what not to do. Much like the Jekyll and Hyde game I brought up at the beginning of this section, this blueprint for a tragic story is something people should study and avoid. If there's a way to avoid the pain that isn't so simple to do and your characters don't do it, it's a bad tragic backstory because it makes you wonder, well, if you're getting involved, why aren't you doing something more? If your characters act in ways that shouldn't logically make sense for them, like establishing a bond between the two characters, then throwing that out to have one attack the other, you can't just bring that back to have them hesitate. One more thing, and this is a minor nitpick, this backstory was revealed in Volume 8 of Rwby, which considering that the character was already established in the first volume, and has done a lot of crap to make her hated, this can come off as being way too late to attempt to make her a smidge sympathetic or even humanize her. To me, this tragic backstory backstory doesn't do anything to make Cinder into a broken character, or at least a decent one. If anything, when you have a broken character like this with a sloppy backstory, it only makes me dislike them as a character more, and not in the good way that a villain should. Oh hey! I'm gonna be talking about Helluva in this video again, and I'm sure that fandom will be reasonable and...
Homer, give him what he wants. Oh, Barney, leave me alone. What?
Well, I guess I won't be fair about this, because I'm talking about the next broken character, and that would be Stolas. Yes, my thoughts on the Goetia character aren't exactly a secret. I've made videos talking about it, but there's an element to Stolas that I do think needs to be discussed a little more, especially in regard to him being a broken character, because let's face it, yeah, Stolas is a broken character. A noble demon who is forced into a loveless marriage with a woman who hates his guts enough to want to kill him, a bird confused with emotions, and dealing with an imp who basically has his own closet of issues. And I've had a bit of an issue with Stolas as a character because, while I would consider him a broken character, a man trying to fill the void that's in his heart, he's probably one of the worst kinds of broken characters, tentatively. There's always a chance I can be wrong on this because the current season isn't over yet. But here's the issue, it's that he doesn't actually learn from the tragedy that gets inflicted on him. And that's really the biggest issue I have with Stolas, because while it seems like he's learning, the show doesn't exactly express it well. The biggest red flag for this is with the Asmodeus crystal that he gets for Blitz. So if you're not familiar with the series, Stolas and the main character Blitz were in a transactional relationship. Blitz gets to keep a magical book that allows him to travel to the human world so he can do his assassination job with his crew, and in return, well, the imp would have to tap that owl, if you know what I mean.
Bow chicka bow, ow!
It was a monthly ritual that the two had, and eventually the two, after one night where things just bubbled up and thrown into their faces, there was a cold realization for the owl. He did have feelings for the imp, but for how things were, Stolas realizes that he's forcing Blitz into the relationship, and is going to try to make things right by getting a crystal that would effectively do the same thing that the book would, and therefore the relationship, transactionally, would end. Sounds good, right? You have a character who has a lot of baggage having a wake-up call, understanding that what they're doing to another character, trying to fill the void with their broken life has left with them, but then they realize they can't do this to the other one, since there would be the same unfair treatment that Stolas had to face in his life, i.e. forcing someone to do something they may not actually want to be a part of. In this case, being in a relationship, which was something that Stolas had to deal with as well. And yeah, that would actually make for a pretty good broken character, using their tragic story to learn from their own behavior was being reflected upon someone else that they cared about. It's the best way to have a hypocritical character evolve from their broken status. The problem is that despite his words, Stolas doesn't really evolve from his behavior. Yes, he does give Blitz the choice to stay with him or not, but how he set things up, i.e. not informing Blitz that his meeting isn't their usual game of guess what's under the covers, he kinda set an unfair expectation. Stolas taking the book without explaining what he's doing for Blitz, which would put the imp into a panic, and then to top it off, Stolas unloaded not only his actual feelings in the Asmodeus crystal at the same time. Now, as anyone can tell you, this is an emotional roller coaster, and the fact that when Blitz was trying to cope with these emotions, Stolas took that as his answer to the relationship. But what makes it hard for me to really accept Stolas as a broken character, it's because in the aftermath he doesn't see anything he did was wrong. Everything is put on Blitz. It's standard fare for these kinds of relationships that end up like this where both sides will see themselves in the right, and that's no different here. And there's a case to be made that Blitz is also in a similar state of Stolas, at least, you know, for this episode in the aftermath, which hey, I'm all for because I'm not exactly the biggest fan of these two characters, and I find Helluva a lot better when the show isn't laser focused on these two. The show will point out that Stolas didn't do anything wrong.
I don't look down on you. How many times do I... When have I ever... Swear to you are so cute when you are serious, and it isn't supposed to be lent out to itty-bitty imps like yourself. Darling Lipsy! Just say my name right.
And this is reinforced by the episode afterwards, Apology Tour, where there's an entire song dedicated to reinforcing that Stolas didn't do anything wrong. Which, hey, I guess it's okay to assume you know exactly what happened in this pseudo-relationship. To be fair though, considering that there are 2 more episodes for this season at the time of me writing this script and recording it, it's always possible that my complaints of there not being a proper retribution will no longer be applicable, but that still wouldn't make me like Stolas as a broken character, since from what I've seen from previews, that doesn't seem like the reality of his behavior concerning Blitz will actually be addressed. Again, I could be wrong, so we'll see in that, but let's talk about something a little different. Let's go... someplace sweet. In my initial video on this subject, I brought up how someone having a tragic background, despite being broken because of it, can take their own experiences and use that to make a positive change for others. I initially used Kinger for that.
Eating a little banana.
But for this video, let's switch it up and bring up the opposing example I had. So one more time, we're talking about Kamen Rider Gavv. I've talked about this series quite a number of times on this channel, and this will probably be the last time I bring it up this year, maybe. But I felt like the idea of showcasing a tragic character who essentially had not only his entire world ripped away, but also by the people he once loved and trusted, is a good idea to look into. So, meet the main character, the actual Kamen Rider Gavv, Shoma Stomach. He's a half-human, half-Granute character. Granutes are the monsters of the series who possess a secondary mouth on their stomachs, and he's a young man who was forced to flee from his homeworld and family after they killed his mother, turning her into spice for dark treats, and tried to kill him, so he ended up in our world. Now, if you have a good functioning pair of ears, you can probably tell where the tragedy comes from. And considering that in the first episode, when Shoma is trying to save a kid from being abducted by another Granute, he laments about his weakness of not being able to save his mother. Of course, when he finally manages to get the power to fight back, he adopts that power to defend humanity from the Granute that want to harvest and process people into addictive snacks. Although, even though he's trying to protect humanity and the home his mom was from, people view Shoma as a monster when he's in his rider form. But instead of allowing that to color his perception of reality and hold it against humanity, Shoma instead continues to fight and protect humans. And it should be noted that he's not trying to outright kill the Granutes who are trying to do this. Shoma is half Granute after all, and the only thing he wants them to do is stop hunting humans and devouring the dark treats.
二度と闇貸しに関わらないか。バカか。闇貸しをやめられるわけないだろ。わかった。
Of course, when they refuse to give up their vice and continue to hurt others, Shoma is left no choice. And it's clear that his motivations do stem from his weakness and failure to save his mother from his corrupted family. It's used to drive Shoma to become a better protector for humans, driving him to improve with every fight. Even if his forms can be somewhat goofy. And it should be obvious that even though Shoma has experienced trauma and that has deeply affected him, I mean, if your own family killed your mother simply because of her race right in front of you and wanted to kill you constantly, that's enough to make anyone messed up. But because of that, Shoma channels that into more positive choices in his life, even when he comes to the idea that he shouldn't be around humans and be positive around them, since the tastiest spice from humans is when they're happy, and that can get more Granutes focused on them. But he realizes that he needs bonds, and humans shouldn't be scared to be happy. So, Shoma actively channels that into finding any and all Granute attacks and dealing with the part-timers who are abducting humans. And to point out, it isn't just the humans who are suffering because of this event. The main idea of the Stomach family is to get high-profile members of the Granute society to become addicted to the dark confections so they can acquire the ability to rule over that world, meaning Shoma's actions are actually helping both worlds. And because of those actions, Shoma is actually being more trusting of people, even if he is an idiot. This to me is how you can really take a tragic backstory, break a character, and then rebuild them into a positive force that can inspire change in others. It does help that the show does have a pretty good blend of dark tones, amazing action, and pretty good comedy. That helps tell a great story on how you can't let tragedy completely color your world, and how you need to grow stronger from it and not let it control you. At least that's how I choose to interpret this story. Let's step back a bit and let me give you a generalized scenario. Picture, if you will, a young girl developing a pretty nasty supernatural ability. Because of said ability, she gets shunned by not only her family, but society at large. And as such, they get recruited into an organization that can exploit their powers. I told you I was going to be general with it, because there are a lot of key differences between the two characters I want to talk about for this section. Aki Izayoi from Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, and Himiko Toga from My Hero Academia. Now, before I go into this one, I want to say that while I'm using Aki as a positive example in this, and Toga as a negative one for broken characters, I do have issues with my positive example, mainly with how it goes into the issues I have with Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds as a whole, but this isn't the video for that rant. Plus, I am aware that there are people who are fans of Toga and appreciate the writing that she has throughout the story. And sure, I've got some snipers trained on me right now, just waiting for me to screw up so they can be the first to type into the comments of what I got wrong.
Got my eyes right on you, you son of a bitch. Now go ahead and say your stupid shit.
No, for this, I want to talk about sympathy, because both of these characters do have sympathetic backgrounds to them, which led them to where they are in their respective series, since both of them are seen as a rejection of normal society, and can also be viewed as broken. Aki developed psychic powers, which made it whenever she used dual monster cards, a key part of the Yu-Gi-Oh! World's infrastructure, the effects of the cards become real, or the monsters become real as well. Meanwhile, Toga, thanks to her quirk, developed a fascination with blood to the point where her parents screwed up, society shunned her, and she drank some boy's blood with a straw. Yummy. I'm not going to delve too deep into their backstories, since I do think when you're establishing how these tragic tales broke both of these characters, they are done well, especially considering that these things happened when they were little kids, and being called a monster by your parents or being slapped by your father, yeah, that can easily break about anyone, especially at that age. This is where we get into the divulging aspects of the characters that I'll have to explain a little more, and then get into why I think one is a good example of a broken character and the other isn't. With Aki, after her parents sent her to the Duel Academy with the hopes of her powers being reined in there, which that failed, good job. She ran away from home after seeing that they were happy without her in their lives. She made her way into the underground, dueling for her survival, where her powers were growing stronger and stronger, and eventually Aki created an alternate persona, the Black Rose, in order to deal with the rejection she constantly got and terrorize other duelists. At least until a man named Divine showed up, another psychic duelist who was the leader of the Arcadia movement and had several other psychic duelists at his beck and call, and offered Aki a means of hope that psychic duelists would be able to be accepted by society one day. However, the truth was that Divine was only interested in Aki as a weapon, aiming to create an entire army of psychic duelists, even to the point where he instilled a command that would have his psychic powers take over her consciousness. Basically, Aki was in a vulnerable state after being rejected by society and was being taken advantage of. It's why when her parents showed up to help her when she was in a coma, she outright rejected them. Even when being told that her parents are in front of her, she can't accept that they do care for her. That to me is how a backstory can break a character, even more so when she can't actively control her power, which can hurt others. And in a sense, the same could be said for Toga, since she was shunned from society because of her quirk's effect on her personality and, well, the obvious blood stuff. It's a core part of MHA's story about how Hero Society and Quirk Society can mess someone up if you don't have the right quirk. And I will give props to that. The problem lies in Toga's choices as a character because, yeah, the villains in the series are born out of the problems of My Hero Academia society. But when you have a character like Toga who does take pleasure out of killing people, even to the point where she's a suspect in a string of murders involving bloodletting, it makes it a little hard for me to see that since she has the choice in that. I understand she has urges and cravings due to her quirk, and I do get that she killed mostly background characters who didn't even have a name, but when you consider that, she didn't have to do it. Hell, one of the major themes of Toga is that she's killing people with the intent of living life of how she wants to, and it feels like pinning her choices through the story on her tragic past, it removes accountability of her character. Meanwhile, Aki has a bit more leeway going on since she was actively being manipulated by Divine and tricked into thinking that she was doing good. I'm more than willing to say this is more of a preference thing on my end, since when looking at Toga, opinions either range from people understanding her perspective, meanwhile others will talk about how accountability is removed from her character because of the backstory. And if I want to be consistent with my own personal views, I do have to say that while a tragic backstory can make a good broken character, it can only do so much for me to give leeway to a character. I can understand to an extent with Toga her motivations, but when we get to the morality of how much that can really excuse a character who does terrible things, But then we get into the morality of how much can you really excuse a character who does terrible things because of their tragic background. Aki, to me, I can understand a bit more, since while she did have a similar backstory with being rejected by her parents and people, she actually had another factor that was a third party that was using her. Plus, it helped that she never actually killed anyone. Though she thought she did when she was accused by one of Divine's victims. Huh, what happened to Divine again? Don't worry folks, the art book says he's alright and got arrested after this. My dunderheadedness aside, one of the things I will criticize Aki's writing is that we don't really see her take accountability for her psychic destruction or hurting others. It pretty much gets memory hold into the second half of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. I guess to me, and I do have a preference when it comes to the writing of these characters, I do want to be fair and not portray one being perfect while I have issues with the other, and of course, what I'm saying is not fact but my own perspective, and you are free to disagree with that. I want to end off this video's examples by saying that not everyone, whether you be real or fictional, can automatically be accepting the tragic events that happen to them. That's what makes a more human character in my opinion, because some people are more or less resilient than others. Sometimes these characters can't go on with the trauma that they have endured, even to the point where that can cripple them. So, I say to you guys one last time, since this segment will have massive spoilers for Persona 5 Royal, then if you don't want to be spoiled, now's your chance to skip to the end, because this does contain endgame spoilers. If you're busy on your draw tablet or you just don't care, you can't say you weren't warned. When you start Persona 5 Royal, past the introduction and setup, you're met with your caretaker Sojiro taking you to school, and he says this.
So that's why it's so crowded. There's been a lot of those lately. In fact, there was a real sad one just last month. It happened before you came here. If I remember right, the girl that passed away was only 15. Her parents have got to be just...
This is in reference to the character that I'm talking about, Kasumi, or to be completely honest, Sumeri Yoshizawa. Before I get into this, I do want to point out there are some issues with Sumeri. Namely, a lot of people will levy the criticism that she feels shoehorned into the plot, which I can't really argue against. After all, when you consider another important character that was included in the revamped game, it feels a lot more natural as you're able to spend a lot more time with the character, and it feels like proper build-up. And I'm being vague on purpose because I know some people will complain about spoilers even though I did give an additional spoiler warning. But back to Sumeri, I can honestly see why people dislike her, especially since she stuck out like a sore thumb. Not helped that the fact that the game pushes her on her as a quote-unquote right romance option for Joker. It can easily be seen as forced onto the player and feel artificial, while the other character feels a lot more naturally slotted in. Not helped is the lock behind the additional third semester portions of her confidant, and it can feel rushed as all hell. Of course, we're not here to discuss that aspect of Royal. I did just want to point out that while I do have my criticisms of the character in the game, I still do maintain that her story is a strong one. This is just something that I believe does hurt the story that the writers of Royal were trying to do. Plus, it didn't help that she was only available to play in the party in the very last palace. Like, could have made her another wild card in the plot of the story and have her show up in other palaces, but whatever. Sumeri's story actually begins when she and her sister Kasumi were walking on a rainy day, with Sumeri angry at her sister and unfortunately... Kasumi died, trying to save Sumeri. And that guilt began to build within Sumeri, to the point where she couldn't actually function as a person. Sumeri had devolved into a depression which, left unchecked, well, things could have gotten a lot worse thanks to survivor's guilt. Sumeri genuinely believed that she caused her sister's death and stole the dream her sister had, to become an uncontested gymnast. This kept on boiling up more and more in her, and things weren't going smooth, at least until Sumeri met with a certain therapist, Takuto Maruki. Sumeri informed him that she couldn't go on unless she was able to live as her sister, carrying on the dream that Kasumi held, and thanks to a hidden power that not even Maruki was aware of, he subconsciously manipulated Sumeri's perception, not only making her think that she was Kasumi, but that the one who actually died in the accident was Sumeri instead. While this act did save her, it didn't solve the underlying issues that Sumeri held. It was a falsehood and she was running away from her identity and emotions. And when that veil is actually lifted... It's like nothing even changed. And Sumeri wants to remain in the delusion of being Kasumi, instead of accepting the truth that she lost her sister. She'll fight for that illusion to be maintained. To me, this is an interesting concept about how a broken character will want to fight to get past the pain they received, but ultimately what they're doing is taking the easy way out. It's not actually confronting the pain that Kasumi's death caused her, and it's understandable to a degree. However, like I said, this story is kneecapped because it essentially takes so long for Sumeri's story to start in the game, and it's tied with Maruki's story as well, so there's going to be a vying of what happens. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it makes it a lot harder for some people to get into the ideas that are being presented in here. Hey, would you look at that? I guess I don't think Persona 5 and Royal are perfect games. Tragedy and the broken characters that are produced from it are a fascinating topic to me, and while I don't think that just a splash of something terrible in the backstory of a character is enough to make me like them as a broken character, since you don't want to be the only thing to make your character empathetic or sympathetic. What the character does with that tragic backstory is key in how to make them an effective broken character. How does the tragedy affect them? Do they use their trauma to grow as a person to prevent similar tragedies from happening? Or do they fall into a deeper despair, becoming a vessel of revenge in the process? Hell, does the character do whatever they can to avoid the pain? These are just a handful of questions that you need to answer when you're talking about this topic, because while a tragedy can hurt a character and propel them onto their path, that can't be used as an excuse for their actions or their future. A broken character is fascinating to examine. How they use their experiences to evolve can be thrilling. So let me ask you, what fictional personas do you think are broken? And what do you think they do to change as a person? Do they change for the good, or do they transform into monsters? Or something else? Let me know in the comments below. Who knows, maybe I'll do videos based on the characters you brought up. Because until next time, I'm MangaKamen. Thanks for watching, and be sure to treasure those you love. Later!